inefficiencies which are connected with stimulating consumerism are simply not tolerable by the species. They will lead to the destruction of the species. So therefore they'll have to be converted to changes of cultural understanding, of social practices, of political practices, economic structure, and so on, so that we overcome market inefficiencies, consumerism, and turn towards a form of viable existence, which also satisfies our human needs much better. The isolation and self-absorption and so on are very harmful just psychically. So it cannot continue this way, and it's increasingly becoming understood.
Perfecto, profesor. Durante la guerra de Vietnam se publicaron fotos de niños vietnamitas heridos en los periódicos estadounidenses. En su libro La responsabilidad de los intelectuales, usted afirmó que estas imágenes podrían afectar el entendimiento y la actitud de los estadounidenses hacia el sufrimiento. En ese sentido, ¿debe haber límites a la libertad de expresión? ¿Cómo pueden establecerse tomando en cuenta el caso Faurisson en Francia? Professor, during the Vietnam War, some photos of wounded Vietnamese kids were published on the American newspapers. In American Power and the New Mandarins, you said these kind of images could affect the American people's attitude and understanding of suffering. In that sense, should there be limits to liberty of expression? How could they be established, taking into account what happened in the Faurisson case in France?
Well, there certainly can be limits on expression. For example, in Stalinist Russia and Hitler Germany, there were strict limits on expression. In fact, in those two totalitarian states, there was a principle. The state determines the truths of history, and you have to keep to them, as determined by the state. If you don't keep to them, you're punished. Well, it happens that in France and a lot of Europe, but fortunately not the United States, there is a strong belief that the state has the right to determine historical truth. And that's what the Faurisson case was about. And what was at issue at the Faurisson case, although there's a lot of propaganda concealing it, is exactly that. He was brought to trial for questioning historical truths about gas chambers that were established by state order. Had nothing to do with the Holocaust, incidentally. It was about gas chambers. And the question, it doesn't matter whether the state happens to be right or wrong. The question is, do we want to accept the Nazi Stalinist principle that the state has the right to determine historical truth and punish deviation from it? And in fact, Faurisson was sentenced on that charge of denying the historical truths about gas chambers that the state had determined were true. Well, I happen to be opposed to Stalinism and Nazism, so therefore I defended his right and would continue to defend anyone's right to say what they think, whatever the holy state tells us about it.
Professor Chomsky, if you agree, we will go on to ask you some questions about foreign policy.
Okay.
The first one of them would be, I'll say in Spanish first. Usted fue un ferviente crítico de la guerra de Vietnam. Específicamente, criticó la forma como el interés nacional estadounidense se definió. ¿Cómo cree usted que el interés nacional estadounidense debe ser definido en la administración Obama? Professor, you were a fervent critic of the Vietnam War. Specifically, you criticized the way in which the American national interest was defined. How do you think American national interest should be defined in the Obama administration?
Well, just as a correction, I don't care. However, first of all, I don't think there is such a thing as the American interest. The interest of a corporate executive and the interests of the janitor who cleans his office are quite different. So the whole idea of an American national interest is mostly a fabrication. I mean, there are some common interests, like not to be destroyed by a foreign enemy, but almost all of policy has to do with special interests of privileged groups. those privileged and powerful groups are in a position to determine what they call the national interest. That's point number one. Secondly, the problem with the Vietnam War, in my opinion, was not a definition of the national interest. I mean, from the point of view of the dominant corporate and state sectors, invading Vietnam was in their interest. And maybe they were right, but that has nothing to do with it. That's like saying that from Hitler's point of view, invading and conquering Europe was in the national interest. Well, maybe so. Lots of Germans agreed with him. But that doesn't mean I supported Hitler's wars. Aggression is just a crime, period. And the United States invaded first South Vietnam, then the rest of Indochina, and largely destroyed it. I don't care in whose interest that was. It still remains a massive crime. As far as Obama is concerned, there's no change. I mean, Obama is described as having a principled objection to the Iraq War. That's just false. His objection to the Iraq War was basically that it wouldn't work. It says he called it a strategic blunder. That's not a principled objection. In Russia in the 1980s, if you read Pravda in, say, 1983, you could read articles saying that invading Afghanistan was a strategic blunder. There's no point to it, it's costing us too much, and so on. We don't call that principled objection. We call it cynical objection. Same in Nazi Germany. After Stalingrad, there were Nazi generals and Nazi political leaders who said that it was a strategic blunder to open a two-front war. Well, maybe it was, but that's hardly a principled objection. And the same is true of Obama's policies right now. So if you look at yesterday's national press, you'll find articles with headlines like saying, the United States rejects President Karzai's plea to stop bombing Afghan civilians. Okay, what's happening? Afghanistan has a president who the U.S. claims was elected democratically. Put aside the question, but he was a U.S. favorite as long as he was following U.S. orders. But he has repeatedly been asking the U.S. to stop bombing his country. And yesterday's headlines said, we don't care what you want, we're going to bomb your country. That's Obama. Is that any change?
Si nos vamos un poquito a América Latina, haciendo una simplificación, se podría decir que hay tres tipos de gobiernos en América Latina hoy en día. Uno sería el de Colombia y México, en la derecha quizás, luego una izquierda moderada con Brasil y Chile, y posteriormente una izquierda más radical con Venezuela y Bolivia. ¿Qué cree usted que implica cada uno de estos tipos de gobierno para América Latina? Y en su opinión, ¿cuál de estos modelos es el más correcto para seguir? Professor Chomsky, if one did an oversimplified analysis of Latin America governments, one might say that there are three types of governments right now. And I would group them as perhaps a typically right-winged government like Colombia and Mexico, then a moderate left like Brazil and Chile, and a more radical left with Venezuela and Bolivia. What do you think each of these governments implies for Latin America? And in your opinion, which of these models have worked the best?
Well, there are very fundamental changes taking place in Latin America, very significant ones. Overall, for the first time in its history, primarily South America, but it's spreading north, for the first time in its history since the Spanish and Portuguese conquests, Latin America is beginning to move towards a degree of independence and a degree of integration among the countries, and also towards sort of an internal integration. I mean, Latin America has been characterized for a long time by the radical split between a small sector of wealth and privilege and a great mass of people suffering in poverty. That's been the most striking feature of Latin America differentiates it from